Hello,
Hi,
everybody.
Erin.
Thank you. It's done, yep. Hello there, everybody, and thank you for coming to join us on Transnatiera tonight. Today is going to be a wee bit different. I suppose they're all different these days, but we are having, this is our book launch, myself and Colum Ruairc. It's called United Irishmen, Immigrants of Erin, and it's been received very well so far, and we're very thankful that's been received so well. And so I'm just going to pass you over now to Colum Ruairc.
Hey everyone. So we're just going to give you a quick breakdown of how we started this book and what we looked at now to find the exiles. And overall, we got about 600 names, and we have the majority of them were from the north and northwest. So we'll go into a bit of detail with that. We'll have a look at a few case studies, and beforehand I'll also break down a bit of a chronology of what happened around the time of the 1798 rebellion and why people fled to America and to France predominantly. So the project came about through the lockdowns. Quite honest with you, we were two bored fellas. We had a bit of a conversation regarding immigrants who left around the time of 1798 and done well for themselves in America. I think it was what really spurred on the project was we got sent a newspaper clipping from Detroit of a man by the name of Waters from County Monaghan who fled to America and died in Detroit in 1887, I think it was. And it went into a bit of detail about how he fled from Ireland. And it was just interesting. Now, it was something that I always wanted to look at through the 1798 Rebellion Casualty Database. Principally, I look at the casualties of the rebellion, and my aim is to give biographies for each of these. I had, at the start of the COVID lockdowns, I also delved into researching the transported Irish, those who were sent to New South Wales or who were impressed into the Crown Forces and the Royal Navy. I have touched off the New South Wales transport because they're actually quite well documented online. The Crown and Royal Naval transported Irish would be quite hard because I need the archives in Dublin for that. I had also planned to do the exiles and fugitives, which I knew would be a much smaller project. So myself and Stephen, we both have an interest in genealogy, so we were talking about various things regarding some of these exiles, and we had the curiosity as well of those who left Ireland post 1798. And it's generally well known that those who left Ireland after the rebellion were predominantly from the north, so that caught Stephen's interest also as well, because there was a lot of people who left from Stephen's home area and so forth. So Stephen would have known a lot of the families who was related to a lot of these exiles, so naturally that was spurring on his interest there. And also Stephen as well did a fantastic book here last summer on the Battle of Antrim. So it's such a very interesting period. So the challenge of where to begin. So because we had no archives, we didn't have the National Archives of Ireland, we didn't have the National Library, or we didn't have Prony. So we relied heavily on a lot of our personal notes, so stuff that we collected ourselves from before COVID. We had our own personal libraries, but we just went hell for leather into it. Like, we just Googled books, typed in 1798 rebellion, stuff like that, United Irishmen in America, and we found a tremendous amount of stuff, mostly from county histories that were published in America for various states in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, some fantastic county histories. I believe one specific area that saw a large influx of Irish exiles after 1798 was Reigate in Vermont, which saw a massive influx of Ulster Presbyterians settling there after the rebellion. Genealogical websites were also a massive benefit to us as well. We had, of course, the newspapers attached to both Ancestry and To Find My Past. We also used Genealogy Bank, which is an American genealogical newspaper database. Now that was also great for the sense that we could look at newspapers that only existed a few years. So that was quite beneficial to us because we were able to delve into the Shamrock, which was a newspaper that was set up by a 98 exile called Thomas O'Connor. And it was naturally, with its name, it was a pro-Irish exile newspaper. It gave us massive amounts of information on exiles, obituaries and so forth, and stories of what was going on with a lot of these exiles. Now, we weren't delving so much into the chronology of the Irish in America in the early 1800s. We were focusing more on biographies of those who went over. But of course, naturally, tie in with the events in America, such as the War of 1812 and so forth, like even the change of politics from the traditional Federalists under John Adams to the Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. The Irish played a massive part in that. So we'll go briefly into that with a few case studies we have. But as you can see here, we have a few snippets of some of those county histories. And you can see here we have where Patrick Lynch, he was originally from Dublin. He served with the Rebel Army through the 1790 Rebellion. He went to America and he established himself in Bennington in Vermont. And it says here he carried out a dry goods business. He married in 1812 Charlotte Gray, and he became an officer in the 1812, the War of 1812. He was known for selling beaver skins, and he died not long after the War of 1812. There was a horrific pandemic that swept across the eastern states of America at that time, the yellow fever. So I believe, from memory, those who have the copies of the book with them now, could be better if you have a look at yourselves now, but I could be wrong, but I believe he died from the fever. But he was quite friendly. Living in Bennington in Vermont, he was quite friendly with Thomas Traynor, who was a high-ranking United Irishman who went to, he fled to America in 1801, I believe. He established an ironworks in Bennington. Traynor had been a close associate with Henry Jackson and Napper Handy, and he'd been actually the treasurer of the Dublin Society of the United Irishmen. There's an amazing story that's recorded in the book about Thomas Traynor, and he was captured not long after the crackdown on the United Irishmen at Oliver Bond's house in March 1798. He was arrested and he was placed in Dublin Castle. But he was a bit of a cue-whore. He decided to come up with a plan of putting a cape around him and got himself a wig, and he was able to get past a sentry in Dublin Castle in the Birmingham Tower and escape out through the moat. And he fled to England. So he was in Cumbria in England, and he was there for a while until about August 1798. And he was finding out that all his friends, the likes of Thomas Addis Emmet and Samuel Nielsen and all these guys were petitioning the state for to be allowed to self-exile. The Kilmainham Treaty where it would divulge information about the United Irish Society, and they could be allowed to go at their own free will anywhere to a country that wasn't at war with Great Britain. But that turned out to not be the case because the American ambassador to Britain, Rufus King, who was a Federalist, a nativist, he was heavily against this Irish influx in America. He didn't want these liberals coming in, disturbing American politics. So what happened was Thomas Traynor ended up coming back to Ireland to try and seek a negotiated deal alongside Thomas Addis Emmet and so forth with Dublin Castle, and he was arrested and put in Kilmainham for a couple of years. He actually shared a cell with William Corbett, and he encouraged William Corbett to escape. He was one of the first escapees from Kilmainham jail. I believe that was in 1799 or 1800. But yeah, we can see everyone's got various stories here. Like you have James Montgomery, he's actually buried. He was 1840. That was his father. William Montgomery, he's buried quite close, within a mile from Fort Knox in Kentucky. We have John Sloan, who's from County Tyrone. There's so many names, but there's so much detail with a lot of these names as well. Unfortunately, there's some names we've only got a couple of sentences for because we literally could not find any more information. But whatever we could find, we put into the book. So area of focus, anyway, it was France, USA, and Hamburg. We could have delved into a lot of the Irish that settled in England and so forth. There was a few that went to Italy and to Spain and Portugal, but we said we agreed that we'd focus on those who went to France to fight for Napoleon, the United States, and those who went to Hamburg. Those predominantly went to Hamburg, eventually went to France. There was a few like Anthony McCann, who we believe the Exile of Erin, the famous song by Thomas Campbell, was actually written for. He remained in Hamburg because we found that in the Chief Secretary Office's notes from the 1830s that he was still petitioning Dublin to see could he return to Ireland to visit his frail old father. So he was in Hamburg up until the 1830s. Many of those who lived in Hamburg, in Altona, we read that they suffered financially. A lot of them couldn't remain. It was impossible. It was such an experience for them. So a lot of them ended up going to France if they were able to acquire a passport for France. So the 1790 rebellion and the choices therefore. So we have the Banishment Act and the Fugitive Bill of 1798, where people were named and shamed basically by the Dublin Castle and by the authorities that if your name is on it, you're out of Ireland, and that's it. You're out for as long as we want you out, under fear of being tried and put to death. So Kevin Whelan, 1780 historian Kevin Whelan, estimated that about 2,000 emigrated to the United States alone. He also estimated about 1,500 were transported, and that about 500 to 600 were United Irishmen alone were sent to Australia between 1799 and 1805. So that was I'll be looking at that myself down the line. 2,000 were sent to the United States. We also looked at a few names who went to Canada. We won't be talking much about them tonight, but there's a good few within the book that settled in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and some interesting stories there. So the majority were from the northern counties, and as you can see here in the pie chart, practically the top northern counties of Antrim, Down, and Derry nearly make up 50% of those recorded, of the 600 names that were recorded. After that, you have Dublin and Wexford. But an interesting point that we noticed was the court martials saw a larger occurrence of sentence remittal to voluntary banishment. Having looked in detail at the Wexford trials and the Carlow Wicklow trials, there's actually I've none that come to mind where sentences were remitted to something like voluntary banishment. Most of them were. There was a good few remitted from execution to transportation to life, but very few got the healthy choice of voluntary banishment. Interestingly, it seems to be just a northern thing, you know. So I'm there questioning, was this the start of divisions that were being caused by Westminster to, I don't know, was it to do with class or with money? Could be that, but I firmly believe it was because the majority of those from the north who were given an option already had relations in America from the mass exodus of Presbyterianism from Ireland from the early 1700s onwards. So they were probably saying, we've got relations in America, look, we'll leave you now, we'll leave you in peace, we'll go over to them if you let us just go. So I reckon that was generally the case. As I mentioned before, Rufus King, he was US ambassador to Britain, and he was quite a blunt man. He had a large influence in both America and in Britain, and because of his influence, Britain would not send the state prisoners to America. They saw it as the vomit of Ireland, this vomit of republicanism that was coming from Ireland, these troublemakers. So it was only really after Jefferson became president in 1800 that these restrictions relaxed for the Irish state prisoners, and they were allowed to eventually go to America. Good few of them slipped in under the Federalist regime under President Adams. Immigration was still occurring from Ireland to the United States, but the well-known figures such as Thomas Addis Emmet and a good few of those were not allowed into the United States. What I find interesting was, having gone through a lot of these biographies, we noticed that the politics of America started to be heavily influenced by the Irish influx. We have the Jefferson versus Adams political war that was going on, the Irish solidified behind President Jefferson. He was seen as the closest thing to the Republican ideals of 1776 and 1789, whereas Adams was a bit of a conservative, stuffy Anglophile. So it was the start of the Irish versus nativists, and it was really the start as well of this organisation of the Irish immigrants that went to America, where Irish immigrants were generally queued in behind, were pushed in behind the local politics in the city. So it was, you have organisations like the Benevolent Sons of St. Patrick and the Irish Immigrant Society, and there were so many of these that when state prisoners did settle in the United States, like Addis Emmet and Dr. William James McNevin and William Sampson, they donated much of their time to keeping these organisations alive for Irish immigrants that were to flow into America throughout the early and mid 1800s. So also I mentioned the War of 1812. A lot of Irish actually settled in America. They wanted to serve their adopted country. They wanted to prove themselves that they were loyal to this new country, this republic that they dreamed of, that they've heard of since their childhood. And many of them fought and died. It was a tremendous war that lasted for 2 or 3 years. But one of the best known examples was Richard Caldwell from Ballymoney, County Antrim, that I believe Stephen's going to mention now later. But he established a local unit of Irish immigrants, but Stephen will talk about him now shortly. So my first case study is Miles Byrne of Monaseed, possibly the most well-known United Irishman from County Wexford, because without his memoirs, we wouldn't know much about what happened in the southeast of Ireland. He's also the only insurgent that we know of that was photographed. Now, this photograph is colorized. It was done by the All Ireland and Colour team, so they actually allowed us to use the image. So thanks very much to them, John Breslin. We also have here I just put in images of the medals that were awarded to Miles Byrne. We have the Order of St. Louis. We have the Medal of St. Helena, which was the Veterans Medal for those who were, I think it was in 1856 that was commissioned. And we also have the Legion of Honour that Miles Byrne received as well in the 1830-31. So Miles Byrne fought throughout the 90-year rebellion across Wexford, Kilkenny and Wicklow. He didn't go into the Midlands. He refused to leave. He thought it was pointless going into the Midlands, and of course he was right. That's where the last of the Wexford Rebellion was crushed. He ended up hiding in Dublin. He became a confidant of Robert Emmet. He was a major player in the Emmet uprising of July 1803, and when that failed, he smuggled out of Dublin aboard an American vessel, and he went to Bordeaux, and from there he went to Paris, connected with Thomas Addis Emmet, who, having been a state prisoner, he'd been sent to Fort George in Scotland with the other state prisoners. And after the Treaty of Amiens, which ended the first, it was a bit of a break between the fighting in the Napoleonic Wars. The state prisoners, as mentioned before, they were allowed to go to the continent to prepare themselves to go to America. Many stayed in the continent, and most couldn't wait to get away from the continent, like Addis Emmet after a period of time in France. But we have Miles Byrne. He settled in Paris. His memoirs are very detailed. He goes into a good bit of detail about the exiles that are there. He mentions Hamden Evans and his wife, and John Sweetman, and so forth. A lot of these Irishmen that settled in France for a period. Excuse me. He ended up joining the Irish Legion, which was set up by Napoleon, by decree of Napoleon in late 1803, with the idea that it was eventually going to go back and take over Ireland, that the French were going to establish a new expedition to go to Ireland, and that these Irish legionnaires were going to be the officers to rally up their old neighbours and relations across Ireland for a French expedition that was believed to have been aimed for 1805 or 1806. It never came into fruition, but you have Miles Byrne became a second lieutenant. I do find interesting is those exiles that had money that clearly came from a wealthy background got higher commissions. You have those who became captains. You have the Gibbonses of County Mayo, who instantaneously were captains and majors within the Irish Legion. You have Arthur O'Connor, with no military experience. He was promoted to general. I think it was Brigadier General by Napoleon, simply because probably Arthur O'Connor was well known for his talk, his charm. But they also believed he was the descendant of Rory O'Connor, which was incorrect. So Byrne served throughout the Peninsular War. He fought at the Battle of Fuentes de Enoro and Ciudad Rodrigo and Barassa. And it's interesting. His memoirs are really interesting. So if you do ever get time, I recommend you pick up his memoirs. You get them online. He also served in after the Napoleonic Wars. He was targeted by the new French authorities, the Bourbon Restoration. He was targeted that he was going to be kicked out, but he remained firm and he was allowed to stay in France. Many of the Irish exiles were booted out of France because of their Bonapartist support. He remained in France as an officer in half pay, so he struggled for quite a long time. And then during the Greek independence wars of the 1830s, he served with a French expeditionary force, which eventually was led by William Corbett, a fellow 98 exile who originally came from County Cork. And in 1835, he married Fanny Horner, and he resided in Paris until his death. He wrote his memoirs. He was photographed in 1858, as you can see here. And he also endorsed the Young Irelander movement. He was great friends with some of the Young Irelanders that were based in France in the late 1850s. So in a sense, it was a continuation of the Republican ideology, of support for militant republicanism from 1798 to mid-19th century republicanism, in a sense. The next case study we're going to look at is Nicholas Harper. Now, Nicholas Harper was a Wexford man as well. He fought at the Battle of Vinegar Hill. He was wounded at the battle. He also lost his two brothers. One was aged 22 and the other one was 24. Harper, after he healed, he escaped to the United States and he became a clerk in the US Treasury Department. He died in late January 1843 in New Jersey. We also have another example of John Boyle from County Antrim. John Boyle ended up becoming chief secretary. He ended up he got a high position in the US Navy. That when in times of cabinet changes during elections in America, he became the de facto. He became basically the man in charge of the US Navy for a few periods. He ended up losing his job. He died also in the 1840s. But it's just interesting. It just shows that the Irish, when they settled in America, they got fantastic. A lot of them got fantastic jobs. Of course, not all. We had a sad story of a man by the name of Matthew Scott, from Carrick-on-Shore, who fell on hard times in America. But we reckon he suffered post-traumatic stress after the 1790 rebellion because it's reported that he was quite maudlin when he was in America, and he returned home only to commit suicide, unfortunately. So Luke Lawless. So the judge to St. Louis wants to forget. So Luke Lawless, he was a distant relation to William Lawless, who was a commander in the Irish Legion, also United Irishman, and a good friend of Lord Edward Fitzgerald. But Luke Lawless was born in 1781. He held a commission in the Irish Legion. But he was promoted to captain because he was sent by the French War Office to come back to Ireland, where he liaised with Archibald Hamilton Rowan and tried to do a numerical count of the British forces that were in Ireland in 1811. He returned to France and he was promoted, but he didn't see any of the major bloodshed that the Irish Legion would suffer in 1813 in the Saxon campaign. He was expelled from France after the Bourbon Restoration. Instead of returning to Ireland, he went to the United States and he took up law, and he settled in St. Louis in Missouri, and he eventually became a judge. Now, in 1836, a case occurred that was so controversial across America that top names in American society who commented on it, including Abraham Lincoln, who was only a young politician at the time. There's so many people commented on this case. It was the lynching of Francis McIntosh. Now, McIntosh was a free black man who'd been recently emancipated. And he was working, I believe, on a ship, and that docked. It docked in St. Louis, and within an hour or two, I believe he was assisting policemen in chasing a robber. And whatever happened, I don't know the full details, but he was eventually caught by the local population and he was lynched. Now, it went to trial, and the whole trial ended up becoming a farce because Luke Lawless, of course, interfered. Being a judge, he shouldn't have to interfere. But he interfered and misled the jury by stating that McIntosh brought it on himself by basically flaunting himself around St. Louis. Now, this is clearly going against United Irish ideals, which are meant to be liberal, left-wing, and anti-abolition. Here, Lawless was displaying these racist tones of that McIntosh basically deserved it because he was a black man walking along the street, and that the trial was being stoked up by abolitionists, and eventually the trial collapsed, and no one actually got tried for it in the end. Lawless was seen as a disgrace, and then he died 10 years later. So interesting Exile connections. I just put in 3 pictures just to sort of give you an idea of the influence that some of these 1780 exiles had. On the left, we have John Wayne. We all know John Wayne, real name Marion Morrison, descended from Robert Morrison from County Antrim, whom we believe to have been a 1798 exile who fled in 1799 with his mother. In the middle here, we have Patrick Bronte, originally known as Patrick Bronte from County Down, Rathfriland, County Down, I believe it is. He's the father of the Bronte sisters, Emily, Charlotte, and Anne. And Patrick's brother, William Bronte, was a rebel during the 1798 rebellion. He fought under General Monroe at the Battle of Ballynahinch. We don't know about Patrick's involvement. He was a liberal fella. Like he studied the classics. He was very well educated. The family homestead was destroyed during the rebellion, and he did leave. He went to England immediately. With 1799, 1800, he went and he changed his name from Bronte to the classical version of Bronte. So that's one connection, another connection there. On the right here, we have another Down connection. We have Patrick Denver. As you can see here, he was born in January 1787 in County Down. So this guy would have been only a mere child during the rebellion. He was only 11 or 12, but his father, also known as Patrick, had served in the rebellion, and that's well recorded in one of those county histories that we mentioned earlier. They settled in Virginia, and this is where the headstone is today. But Patrick Denver was buried here. His son, I believe it was William James Denver. He ended up becoming a statesman, a general in the U.S. forces, and the city of Denver in Colorado is actually called after him. So there you have three interesting connections that we all know of. We all know of John Wayne. Many of us have heard of the Bronte sisters and their literature. We basically all have heard of Denver in Colorado. So that's the end for me. You want to come back in there, Stephen?
Thank you very much, Colum. That was very good. I'm just going to share my screen now, okay? Okay, so our book here is on the right. I'll just hold it up. This it here. It's a 208 or so pages, and there's probably over 600 people mentioned it. And probably to start, not for Saturday night, and I think Colum's told you quite a lot there already, But to start off with, I shared the book on Twitter there not so long ago, a couple of weeks ago, before it was published, and a DEP councillor got back to me and said, "That's a rare name for a book. I think of other names for it, Now, this is a boy who hadn't read the book, hadn't asked me about the book, didn't know anything about the book. And, but why have we called it Emigre of Erin? Basically, everybody who fought in 1798 rebellion and the other one in 1803, they all wanted to continue the fight, but they couldn't continue it from America. They had to go to France. And the ship that was docked in Belfast Lough was called the Postlethwaite. Now, it was full of Presbyterian ministers and people being trained up in the Presbyterian ministry who were arrested, and they were held in that ship. And the Caldwell brothers, they hired a ship in 1799 to take them all to America. And that happened. They went, the ship was full and they went to America. But they were all complaining, we want to be left, we want to continue this, we want to go, we want to be left off in France here. Why can't you leave us off? And there's a couple of records here for a couple of ministers. They basically want to continue the fight and they want to go to France. So that's why we named the book Emigres of Erin. So any DUP councillors on it, now you know. So there you go. Okay, so next page. So as you know, Ulster Scots became the Scots Irish in America. But why did they go to America? Why was that so important for them? The plantation went on in 1614. That was the start of it all. The Eagle Wing tried to take a load of Presbyterians in 1640. But by 1680, there was a steady stream of Presbyterian people from the shores of the north here. 1718, there was the big migration led by Reverend McGregor and Reverend Woodside from County Derry, Londonderry. And also in 1716, you have Reverend Hugh Conn went over to America. He set up Princeton University. Well, the college, the Bible college, which was to mutate into Princeton College, the famous one. Okay, so people already had that link to America. It was already there in people's heads, and there was a continuous stream. I think 1740, there was a call from Georgia Governor Georgia, looking for Presbyterians to come over and settle our land, for they haven't got enough people. And then that further influenced another couple of thousand to continue that immigration over. So they all had friends, they all had family, and they all had the links to America already. Moving on, Reverend Samuel Butler, who I've studied a fair bit already, he was born in Ralstown. He witnessed what happened in Ralstown in 1790. The picture there is Ralstown Old Congregation Church, Presbyterian. It was opened up during the 1798 rebellion, and the children and the women all went in there to take refuge. Now, Lawless Presbyterian Church in Ralstown, it was under Reverend Smith. He was in the middle of fighting, and he had to get out quick. So he exiled to Pennsylvania. Reverend Samuel Butler, he writes in 1815 that the Catholics lie down and get beat like dogs, and the Presbyterians up and leave for America and beyond. But probably, I think this is because they didn't have that link to the land. The link to land wasn't there yet. They had only 100 years or so in Britain here, and all the planter people, the people of the time of the plantation, they had either, there was a big rising in 1640s, and that either made a lot of people leave or come back during the Scottish, the famine of 1670, 1680. There was another big influx of Presbyterians over to Ulster here. So the Catholic people, they had the links to the land already. It was their land from generations upon generations before, and they wanted to stay. Colum's already said that a lot of them went to France, but to be honest with you, I think we only found one Roman Catholic priest who exiled. There was maybe, I don't know if we had 100, but it was very close to 100 Presbyterian ministers or probationers, people being trained into the ministry, up and leaving and went off to America. Reverend Smith was one of them. Okay, so we'll just carry on. Okay, the example is the Ballymony immigrants. Okay, Caldwell family was a big mercantile family outside Ballymony. There was a big family, and they were very rich. The two brothers, Richard and John, They led the Ballymoney folk. They were officers in the rising. Sorry, Richard was primarily. He was only, I think he was only 18 at the time, but he led the Ballymoney Brigade, United Irishmen, and they all, because of him, they all had to up sticks and leave. The whole family, there was maybe 10 or so Caldwells had to leave. So an interesting find was in the obituary of John Caldwell, Richard's brother. At the time of the rising, he would have been about 24, 25, which was I think 18 or 19. So his obituary stated that he was fluent and able to speak in Irish, which was odd because I never heard that before. And it has been well, the Caldwells have been well researched in the past. And if you just type into Google or Wikipedia or anything out there, they'll come up, you know, but nothing tells you about maybe how it was different back then, that Irish was a language which was known and used more, a lot more. So Richard, they go and they set up shop outside New York. John Caldwell Jr., he goes into New York and he becomes very rich, newspaper as a printer, you know, and the Hibernian Society, and he gets involved with everything Irish, really. Richard is like a wee rebel. He stays with his father, and they have a big farm, and then they plant mills and all the rest. So they become very wealthy. But in 1812, when war is declared with Britain, America, you know, Richard goes out and he gathers about 50 other men who immigrated with him to America. And there's half a dozen Ballymoney folk that we found who were members of his brigade, which was called Irish Blues. Now, what the Irish Blues did was they marched on Canada. Now, Richard didn't get that far. He actually passed away only a few hundred, it's only a couple of miles from the Canadian border, and he didn't hear song. But he's remembered in a couple of big memorials outside New York, which is good. Next one is Francis McKinley. Anybody in Korean who have a bit of a sense of history about them knows about Francis McKinley. He was hanged for his part in the rising. But no one really talks about the rest of his family, or no one ever, it's never been read about, or no one ever knows, or it's never really been talked about. But Colum there found an article in 1880, and I'm not too sure where it was, but this article stated that the author of it told about two uncles, McKinleys, who had exiled to America, one to Pennsylvania and one to Ohio. The article was saying it was about President McKinley. He was running for, well, he was at the time he was running for president, and it was basically saying that he shouldn't be running about calling himself Scots Irish. He should be calling himself Irish. So I don't think at the time they knew, or that family who read the article knew, that they were probably related to the next President William McKinley. His article states that he was that they left family in Coleraine and a farm on the border of County Antrim and County Derry, which is Connacher, where they all lived. So she was writing in about her two uncles that had exiled. They were both named McKinley. They're from Coleraine, Connacher, and lo and behold, she was complaining about the next president, William McKinley, who was about to become president, and because he was calling himself Scots Irish, he should really call himself Irish, which was a wee bit funny, you know. The next person is Reverend James McKinley. Okay, so he was born in Cookstown, and then he went off to, like many here going into the clergy, went off to Glasgow to he preached, or he studied theology and then medicine and law. So he was, after he graduated, he went into the Reformed Presbyterian Church. And at that time in Ireland here in the north, it was very separated and there wasn't really one cohesive group. So when he came back to Northern Ireland, he went all around Ballymoney, all up the north coast, and he reorganized the presbytery with Kilwater and Reverend Staveley and all the rest, and really formed the basis of the Reformed Presbyterian Church today. But he was probably, I would love to hear him, because, you know, people came from 30, 40 miles away to come to hear James McKinley speak. There's a couple of people writing in the 1830s that they traveled from as far away as 30 or 40 miles away to hear him. But outside Ballymoniey, he gave this big rousing speech, and these speeches could go on for hours and hours, about the rights of God. And this gained the attention of the authorities. It was basically seeing God as your number one above everybody else, including the king. And this didn't bode well for the authorities at the time. So he was arrested. He was put in jail without charge for, I think it was 3 or 4 months, and then he was let out. And again, like Ulster folk, he just does it again. The authorities come after him, and he managed to escape to Ballykelly, where, if anybody knows that area in Lough Fowl, you go out maybe 2 or 3 miles before your head height in the water. So he goes, one of his parishioners or people who followed him, he got on the back of one of them, and he went out to row on boat, which took him out the ship, dry out and then off to America. In America, he travels all the East Coast, preaching everywhere he could, and he really is one of them people who he reorganizes the whole church out there, the whole Reformed Presbyterian Church. He got the whole place gathered up into different presbyteries, and he did an excellent job, you know. He was a fervent abolitionist, and he said that this was a blight on the country, that that so many had slaves, and he would from as soon as he got to America, 1793, he seen that this was a blight in the country, and he went about saying this is wrong. I think one of his big achievements of the Ulster Scots was that in Vermont and Reigate, supposedly it was never a slave there. Now, Reverend Gibson from Ballymoney, when he emigrated, he was able to, after William Orr was executed, the whole tier of other ministers left in 1797. Because of James McKinley, they all funneled into a place called Reigate, and in Vermont, outside New York. So it was there that, as Colum already suggested or told us, that many of them went to. But the Gibsons, they were Reverend Gibson, he was from Ballymoney, but he in fact became Presbyterian ministers out in America there. So another one was Reverend James Hull. He was a son of Limavady born minister. He went over to Glasgow, and then he was licensed in Bangor into the Newton Arts Presbytery. He wasn't given his full minister. He wasn't a full minister yet at the time of the rising. During the date of the rising, he went up Scrabo Hill looking for all the people who said they were going to rise at the time. He couldn't find them, except for another couple of other probationers. So during the Battle of Ballynahinch, he was in the thick of fighting, and he eventually, after the rebellion, he had to flee fairly fast and over to America. So he went and settled outside. It wasn't New Orleans first, but it was. I just can't mind it offhand at the minute. But he eventually, as soon as he got to America, he was Presbyterian. He started baptizing people and holding services. Now, he wasn't a minister this time, and he was never officially a minister of the Presbyterian Church, but he just off his own back, he started ministering and holding services and marrying people and all the rest. But after 10 years doing that there, he got bored, and then he started up with law practice. The law practice didn't do much, and I think after 5 or 6 years he failed. So eventually went down to New Orleans, and at that time, New Orleans was a bustling city. But then 1812 comes, and sorry, just before 1812, he gets called to the cathedral in New Orleans. At that time, there was no one, the Episcopalian, cathedral. They were, for a long time, they couldn't find a minister. For the past 6 months before James Hall was called, they had a Methodist minister, and that didn't go down well with the congregation. So James Hall, they knew that he was in town, and he had been practicing for quite a while now. He was called to the cathedral in New Orleans as a Episcopalian minister, but that didn't really bother him to change from Presbyterian to, Church of England or Church of Ireland. That'd be the same difference as being Episcopalian. Didn't make much difference. So within 6 months, the war with Britain happened, and when General Jackson was rallying his forces to come to the Battle of New Orleans, he went to the cathedral and he had a service. Now, after the service, Jackson he didn't know who James Hall was, but James Hall had probably written to him, because in the records, you nearly have all these exiles writing to the generals and the presidents at the time, looking for money or looking for positions in the army, or but there's a wee quote there from James Hall when he meets Jackson. So Jackson says, "I don't presume you will go with us to fight the enemy." Hall replied, "Why not, General? If you will take me with you." Jackson said, "How could you help us, dear Blackcoat?" Now, all the clergy at that time wore black coats, so that's why he was named Blackcoat. "Why, I have some encounters with the redcoats, and perhaps could use some help." Now, at the Battle of Ballymoney, or no, it was at the same field, he was stated as saying, "I'm going for the cannon here," Then at the Battle of Ballymoney, he was in the thick of the fighting. So I think it's funny there that he had struck gold there when he went to service, and there James was. So next one, this is just the Battle of New Orleans in 1812, and that is Andrew Jackson, leading the charge against the Highlanders. They were victorious, and I like to think that James Hall was in amongst them all. Andrew Jackson then becomes the president of the America in, I think it's 1826. Someone can correct me on that there if I'm wrong. But that's really it for today. Stop share. If anybody has any questions or anything, put them in the question box. It was a privilege doing this, and a lot of credit goes to Colum here. Because I think one funny wee bit was Colum's computer broke down in the middle of researching, and he's a wild boy from this, cutting things out and just firing them over to me. So he was like posting me 10 or 20 news articles every night, and the next day looking to see if I had them written up. You can only do about 3 at the most a night, and checking them with Find a Grave and Ancestry, seeing if it's actually legit. There's no patience in that boy, But all fair play to him, and it's been very well received. The reception's been brilliant so far, and I hope this is just the first to come of many. I'm very privileged to have friends. He also helped me. There's a lot of people on Facebook came forward to give information about their ancestors that we didn't have a clue about, and who would never have been recorded unless we had put out a couple of calls for these people to come forward with their ancestor stories, which we can't thank enough. There's a half dozen people we could thank, but just don't know them offhand at the minute, but who yous are. And I hope we've done your ancestors proud, and this is the first of the kind that we could find anyway. So we're just very grateful for the help that we've had over the past year, So I think I'll just throw you over here to Colum again, see if he has anything else to say. Okay, Colum?
Hi, Stephen. No, just what I just found interesting. I actually forgot to mention. We just mentioned about General Jackson, Andrew Jackson. I think he, along with Napoleon, they're the most commonly mentioned names throughout the book. They're mixed up with so many of the exiles. Napoleon, of course, he knew Arthur O'Connor and Napper Tandy and so forth. General Jackson, as you mentioned, Reverend Hull, and he was also great friends with the Porters. Anybody who's familiar with the Down 1798 history, we have Reverend James Porter, who was executed outside Grey Abbey, the Church of Grey Abbey in July 1798. Reverend Porter was a renowned liberal Presbyterian minister who wrote under an alias for the Northern Star when it was going. But interestingly, his sons, James Jr. and William, I believe it is, they went to Nashville, and it was also interesting. Another family, well-known United Irish family, the Jacksons of Ballybay in County Monaghan, where Henry Jackson, the leading United Irishman, he was connected to that family. But some of the Jacksons of Ballybay also settled in Nashville, and they were all connected with Andrew Jackson, and were no relations. The Ballybay Jacksons were not related to Andrew Jackson. But Jackson seems to be a bit of a cantankerous old whore. Like he's very vain. He likes to call duels against people who disagree with him. And I believe actually one of the Jacksons, James Jackson, was threatened with a duel in the 1820s after basically financing Andrew Jackson's military campaigns against the Indians and over the years. But he gave sound advice to the Porters to move to Alabama, and James Jackson Jr. actually also established himself in Alabama, but interestingly, they became slave owners on sugarcane plantations. We did come across that there were several United Irishmen and sons of United Irishmen profited off slavery. We have Herman Blennerhassett, for those from County Kerry, the beautiful kingdom that it is. If I was to ever see anybody promoting or celebrating Herman Blennerhassett, you'd be very quickly pulled up for the fact that he owned an exquisitely fine mansion on an island on the Ohio River, but he had slaves. He was a slave owner. Also a mass prophet. He was very hell-bent into making serious profit very quickly. He ended up failing in America and he died in England. But we also have there was who else was there? There was John McGlaherty who fought in the Battle of Antrim. He died aboard a slave ship off the coast of Guinea in Africa while he was going over to try and acquire slaves. But we also have, like, there's so many other names. Like, we could have talked all night and tomorrow with names and stories. Some of like I mentioned before, we had a lot of success stories, we had a lot of sad stories and so forth. But we have like a lot of the input on early America. We have, of course, the story of John Nielsen from Ballycarry in County Antrim, and anybody that has a general knowledge of the 98 rebellion, we've all heard of the story of Willie Nelson, the 16-year-old boy from Ballycarry, who was taken by Crown forces and executed close to his mother's home. He was basically the Kevin Barry of the 1798 rebellion. And his brothers, Samuel and John, were sentenced to serve the king abroad. Now, generally, when anybody who's sentenced to serve the king abroad in 1788, it was basically a death sentence because they were sent to the West Indies, where there was a high mortality rate because of the tropical diseases and so forth. And they managed to escape because I don't know how they actually managed to escape. It's the same with the story of Andrew Bryson from Bangor in County Down. They escaped from the West Indies. I believe it was the island of Martinique, but they ended up he went to America, and because he served an apprenticeship in America as an architect, President Jefferson actually hired him to work on the Monticello estate, which you find on the back of an American, is it nickel or dime, one of the coins in America anyway. But that's a product of a 1790 exile who done well for himself in America. Anybody who's familiar with Lower Manhattan in America, close to the World Trade Center, you find St. Paul's Church, small 18th century church, beautiful little church that escaped destruction during 9/11. But on each side of the door, you'll find two obelisks. And one is dedicated to Thomas Addis Emmet, and the other is to his friend, Dr. William James McNevin, both United Irishmen. So it just shows within the heartland of New York, within the heartland of early America, you find such recognition for these United Irishmen that went over and carried out. They were so influential in early America. We know that Thomas Addis Emmet, he refused to ever set foot in the southern states of America because of the slavery that was going on there. Each and every single one of them all had an input in America. Like, just going through the book briefly, there isn't a name that doesn't have a fantastic story attached to it. You know, like, we have Lady Pamela Fitzgerald, we have the story of Matilda Tone's wife, and they suffered financially. Like, you'd expect them to become, because they came from affluent backgrounds, that they would have been secure, but they weren't. They were cut off from their families, or they suffered. Matilda Tone's story is actually quite fascinating. She suffered much poverty whilst in Paris, just to see her son William Tone become greatly educated, and she actually had the gall to go up to Napoleon while he was out hunting one day, just far short of grabbing by the scruff of the neck and say, "Look after my son, because you knew my father," or you knew his father, Theobald of Tone. In fairness to Napoleon, he actually looked after William Tone, and he served with distinction in the later stages of the Napoleonic Wars before he went to America. There's so many other great stories of people from all across Ireland, from north to south, from east to west, and just quickly going through looking at the Irish Legion stories. I'd like to thank Dr. Nicholas Dunn Lynch there, because he was a great help. He's a fascinating historian regarding the Irish Legion. Also, I'd like to thank Stephen, because he had the patience of a saint, because if I could be sending him those 10 or 15 articles at 5 o'clock in the morning as he's getting up for bed and I'm going into work, and he'd never go on to give out to me. He'd never say, "F off with yourself now, just take a break." At that. No, he was great that way. He had the patience of a saint. We're both victims of displaying great detail. So you'll see that in the book as well. So I'd like to thank Stephen as well for taking on this book with me as well. So it's been a great journey, and how quick it's gone. It's been amazing. We were just discussing here before we started how quick it's gone. And here's to many more. And I'll pass it back to you, Stephen. Thanks everyone actually for purchasing it as well. I hope you all enjoyed.
Okay, folks. I think that's all for tonight, really. I don't think there's any questions there as far as I can see. How representative do you think your 600 names are of National United Irishmen membership? A lot of the exiles didn't. They said they were never in the United Irishmen, but it really doesn't matter. For at that time, it was a serious crackdown, and if they weren't, a lot of people who exiled before the actual risings would have probably been members of it or leaders of the rebellion if they had stayed. The likes of William McKinley, Reverend James McKinley, who I outlined, he always stated he was never a United Irishman, but he was a firebrand minister, much like, well, you compare him to the likes of Paisley in the 70s or 80s, you know, people came from miles to hear him, and he was on the ball. United Irish, his services were, you know, we want reform and give the Roman Catholics and Presbyterians a vote. You know, it was all geared up towards United Irishmen membership in the future if they stayed. Others go over to the likes of Philadelphia and Baltimore and join the United Irish societies and, you know, stay as United Irishmen throughout. So what about Leinster there, Colum? Could you maybe chat about it?
See, just to add on to that, a lot of the names we found, like in those county histories from Pennsylvania or from Georgia or South Carolina and so forth, they're very brief in their mentions about the connections with Ireland. Like they don't really go into much detail. Like these weren't, a lot of the names we have aren't actually well known, the United Irishmen. In some cases, we actually discussed it amongst ourselves when it says that they were connected to the 1790 rebellion in Ireland. Were they actually insurgents or were they yeomen or loyalists? We can't actually tell. A lot of those who went to Canada, we believe, were loyalists because, of course, Canada was a British part of the Commonwealth, and also the Orange Order established itself quite well there in the 1800s, especially the son of Hunter Gowan being a massive organizer there. In Leinster, as mentioned, from memory of looking back through the rebellion papers in the National Archives and looking at the trials and stuff like that, I think it's because the Leinster rebellion was a lot more horrific. It wasn't a sectarian war. I wouldn't say that. There was elements of sectarianism on all sides. It's quite annoying as somebody who studies 1798 history, especially when you look at the Wikipedia page and you see Skull of Oak and Wexford Bridge predominantly being focused upon, whereas the massacre on Gibbet Rath in Kildare was twice as bad, and it's rarely mentioned, where unarmed people were butchered. We have so many cases of butchery that occurred across Leinster. And I'm sure then when they came in to try a lot of these guys, well, interestingly, 99% of the trials are focused on insurgents and what their actions. You see very, very few about trials of yeomen who carried out bloodshed. We have, they reckon, a quarter of the Wexford population was wiped out during the rebellion. So that highlights how horrific it was. Wicklow carried on for 5 years afterwards, but Wicklow was a bit of a tit-for-tat sectarian, at times sectarian fueled guerrilla warfare as well. No, actually, no, I'd be wrong in saying that because of many Church of Ireland people looked after Michael Dwyer in the Glen of Imal. There was moments of sectarianism, I should say. But yeah, the judicial system, the court martials that were occurring. I'm still waiting to find a remittal of sentence to self exile from any person from Wexford, Wicklow, Carlow, Kildare. The majority were sentenced to death, acquitted, or sentenced to transportation. Those are money, of course, from Kildare. Those from well-to-do backgrounds, like Edward Fitzgerald of Wexford, of New Park, not Lord Edward Fitzgerald. He was allowed to exile himself because he came from a well-to-do family. We have William Aylmer and Hugh Ware. So William Aylmer from Painstown in North County Kildare, he was allowed to leave. He went to the continent and served in the Austrian army during the Napoleonic Wars. But it's down to a class thing again. Like it's if you have money, you'll get away with it. If you're a labourer, a cottager, a peasant, good luck to you. You know, so that's but yeah, in overall, the Northern Rebellion only lasted realistically a week. Down south it lasted for 6, 7, 8 weeks. So you can see why.
Okay, I think that's really it for now, Colum. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. I know it's Saturday night and you probably better things to do now, you know. But our next talk is on Saturday, or sorry, it's on Wednesday coming, and it's The Long View, Derry from Partition to Civil Rights by Margot Shea, and that's on Wednesday next, okay? Thank you again to Colum and everybody for tuning in, and everybody's bought the book. Thank you very much. Good night, okay?